Oh, they had a plan. A beautiful, intricate, absolutely foolproof plan. The young ones of the Vithara Collective, 4 juvenile aliens ranging in age from what humans would call 8 to 14, had spent the better part of 3 rotations scheming, whispering, giggling in that high-pitched, multitonal way that sounds like someone dropped a bag of wind chimes down a staircase. They had researched, they had prepared, they were by every measure of their considerable intellect, ready. The human had no idea what was coming. Her name was Priya Okafor-Mendes, and she had been hired as a temporary caretaker for the Vithara household, while Ambassador Thesson and his mate Vorin attended the interspecies diplomatic accord on Keplan Station. She came highly recommended. She had a degree in xenopediatric education, 3 years of experience working with multi-species youth programs on Relay Station 9, and according to her references, an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure. The Vithara children had read all of this. They had filed it away, and then they had decided, with the gleeful certainty that only children who have never truly been frightened can muster, that none of it would save her. The oldest was Sethic, 14 years old in human terms, roughly equivalent to a very smug teenager, which is honestly a universal constant across every species I've ever observed. Then came Liura, the 12-year-old who had somehow already mastered the art of looking innocent while being categorically the most dangerous person in any room. Below her was Torvin, a 10-year-old whose bioluminescent patches flickered anxiety yellow approximately 90% of the time, and who was almost certainly going to crack under pressure. And finally the youngest, little Missa, 8 years old, 4 eyes, 6 fingers on each hand, and an enthusiasm for chaos that I personally found deeply respectable. Their plan was as follows. Phase 1. Create strange sounds in the walls. Phase 2. Activate the household's emergency lighting in patterns that suggested something was moving through the corridors. Phase 3. Use Torvin's pet, a creature called a graveling, which resembles a large wet shadow with teeth, to appear suddenly around corners. And Phase 4. The grand finale, have Sethic drop from the ceiling in full bioluminescent display, and scream directly into the human's face. They had timed it. They had rehearsed. Sethic had practiced his scream. Priya arrived at 1700 station time, rolling a small bag through the front door with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this exact thing on a dozen different worlds. She took a slow look around the Vithara home, the curved organic walls, the soft phosphorescent lighting, the furniture designed for bodies with more joints than hers, and she nodded to herself. Just nodded, like she'd seen it all before. Which, for the record, she had. Priya Okafor-Mendes, said the household AI. A system the family called Ellen, in a smooth, gender-neutral voice. The children are in the lower habitat. Ambassador Thesson has left dietary schedules, sleep protocols, and emergency contact frequencies on the central console. Thank you, Ellen, Priya said, setting her bag down and already pulling up the schedule on her personal comm. What's their current mood, Red? A brief pause. Elevated. Sethic's heart rate is higher than his baseline. Liura has been accessing the secondary lighting console. Torvin released his graveling from its enclosure approximately 40 minutes ago. Priya looked up from her comic. Slowly. And Missa? She's been very quiet, Ellen said. And if a household AI could sound uncomfortable, this one was doing a remarkable impression of it. Priya took exactly 3 seconds to process this information. Then she smiled. Not a big smile, just a small, private one. The kind you make when something confirms a suspicion you already had. She tucked her comm away, rolled up the sleeves of her jacket, and walked toward the lower habitat. She'd worked with Vithara children before. Not this family specifically, but the species. She knew they were clever. She knew they were creative. She also knew that Vithara juveniles, for all their considerable intelligence, had spent their entire evolutionary history as prey animals on their homeworld, which meant that at a neurological level, deep down, underneath all the scheming and the bioluminescence and the smug teenager energy, they startled very, very easily. She'd filed that away too. Phase 1 began at 1800 hours, almost exactly as scheduled, which honestly I respect. The sounds in the walls started as a low, rhythmic thumping, structured, deliberate, clearly coming from a juvenile with more enthusiasm than subtlety. Priya was in the common area reviewing the dietary schedules when it started. She didn't look up. She made a small note on her comm. The thumping grew louder. She turned a page. It grew louder still, and then stopped abruptly. The way things stop when the people creating them realize they're not getting the reaction they expected. Silence. Then, from somewhere in the ventilation system, the unmistakable sound of Torvin's anxiety yellow patches flickering. You could practically hear him second-guessing everything. Phase 2 activated 12 minutes later. The lights in the far corridor shifting into an irregular pulse, moving in a pattern clearly designed to suggest something large and uneven, was walking through the dark. Priya looked up at this one. She tilted her head slightly, then she picked up her comm and sent a message to Ellen. "Can you log the secondary lighting access times for my report to the ambassador? Thanks." Ellen replied instantly. "Already noted." From inside the walls, from behind the vents, from somewhere in the lower habitat, 4 alien children were having a silent, frantic conference. Because the human wasn't scared. She wasn't even curious. She was doing paperwork. This was not in the research. Phase 3 came at 1900 hours, and I will give them full credit here. The graveling was an inspired choice. These animals are genuinely unsettling. They move without sound. They have no fixed shape in low light, just a vague impression of too many angles arranged in a way that makes your hindbrain start filing emergency reports. The graveling came around the corner of the corridor while Priya was walking toward the kitchen, and it positioned itself directly in her path, approximately 1 meter away, doing that thing gravelings do where they sort of expand slightly at the edges, like a bad dream remembering more of itself. Priya stopped. The graveling pulsed. Priya looked at it for a long moment. Then she crouched down, slowly, carefully, in the non-threatening posture she'd learned in her xenopediatric training, and she made a low sound at the back of her throat. Not words, just a sound. The kind of sound that carries in its frequency a very specific message, which loosely translated means, "I see you, I'm not afraid of you, and I would like to be friends." The graveling tilted, expanded a little more, tilted again, and then it walked directly to Priya, and pressed the approximate location of its head against her knee. From inside the ventilation shaft directly above this scene, there was the very distinct sound of Missa trying not to laugh. Priya reached up and knocked twice on the ventilation grate. "You can come out now," she said pleasantly, "if you want. Dinner's in 20 minutes. The grate opened. Missa dropped out and landed on her 6 feet with the practiced ease of a child who had done this many times, in many places, for many reasons. She looked at Priya. She looked at the graveling, which was now enthusiastically pressing itself against the human's legs. She looked back at Priya. "You knew," Missa said. "It wasn't a question." "Since you let the graveling out 40 minutes before I arrived," Priya confirmed. "Ellen told you." "Ellen told me. Also, your brother's heart rate was elevated on the biometrics." Missa processed this. "We are going to have a conversation with Ellen," she said gravely. "That's fair," Priya agreed. "But dinner first." And for a moment, just a moment, it looked like the plan had simply dissolved. Like all the scheming and the rehearsing, and Sethic's practiced scream had simply evaporated in the face of a woman who had done her homework and kept her receipts. It looked like Phase 4 was never going to happen, and the Vithara children were going to eat their evening meal in thoughtful, humbled silence. But here's the thing about Sethic. He was 14. He had practiced that scream, and no force in this universe or any adjacent one was going to stop him from using it. So at 1922 hours, while Priya was in the kitchen reviewing the dietary schedule, and Missa was sitting on the counter watching her with new and cautious respect, while Liura was pretending to read in the common area, and Torvin was somewhere being anxious, Sethic dropped from the ceiling. He hit every mark. Full bioluminescent display, every patch on his body blazing white gold, his secondary membrane fanning out behind his head to triple his apparent size. He landed in the center of the kitchen in perfect silence, 1 full meter behind Priya, and he drew in a tremendous breath, and he released the scream he had been practicing for 3 rotations directly at the back of her head. It was, genuinely, an impressive scream. Priya did not scream back. She did not flinch, or stumble, or drop anything. What she did, what she had been quietly preparing to do since the moment she'd understood, with perfect clarity, that Phase 4 was still coming, was spin on her heel, look directly into Sethic's blazing, fully displayed face from a distance of approximately 30 centimeters, and make a sound. Not a scream. Not a shout. A sound. Low, resonant, produced from somewhere deep in the human chest. A sound that has no direct translation in the Vithara language, but which every prey-evolved nervous system in the galaxy hears the exact same way. The sound a large predator makes when something smaller has surprised it, and it is deciding, in the next half-second, whether to be annoyed or hungry. Sethic's bioluminescence went out. Every single patch, all at once. His secondary membrane snapped back. His 4 knees, working entirely without permission from his brain, bent, and he sat down very suddenly on the kitchen floor, with a sound like a bag of expensive groceries being dropped by someone who was no longer paying attention to the groceries. Missa, on the counter, made a noise that was half laugh and half something that in humans we'd call reverence. Liura appeared in the doorway, took one look at Sethic on the floor with all his lights off, and said, with the flat certainty of a 12-year-old who has just witnessed something that will inform the rest of her life, "I told you it wasn't going to work." Torvin materialized from somewhere behind her, his patches blazing full anxiety yellow, looked at the scene, and immediately turned around to go back to wherever he'd been processing his feelings. Priya looked down at Sethic. Sethic looked up at Priya. His patches were still dark. His membrane was still retracted. He was sitting on the floor of his own kitchen, and he was, for the first time in his 14 years of very successful scheming, absolutely certain he had made a mistake. Priya tilted her head. "Dinner," she said, "is in 15 minutes. Do you want to help?" Sethic helped with dinner. He didn't say much. He handed Priya the correct containers when she asked, operated the heating unit with the quiet efficiency of someone whose brain was still running a full diagnostic on what had just happened, and occasionally glanced at her sideways with the particular expression of a teenager who has been humbled but hasn't fully decided how he feels about it yet. His bioluminescent patches had come back online gradually, the way lights do after a power fluctuation. First the small ones along his jaw, then the larger ones across his shoulders, all of them glowing at about 60% of their usual intensity. The alien equivalent of someone who'd been caught doing something embarrassing and hadn't quite recovered their composure. Missa sat on the counter the entire time, watching Priya with the focused, unblinking attention of a scientist who has just discovered a new phenomenon and is deeply committed to understanding it. She asked questions, many questions. What was that sound you made? Where does it come from? Can all humans do it? Can you do it again? What does it feel like from the inside? Do you know it's frightening? Did you know it was going to work? I had a reasonable expectation, Priya told her, setting out 5 portions of the approved dietary plan, with the calm efficiency that was, by this point, beginning to seem less like a personality trait, and more like a fundamental law of her existence. You were not afraid, Missa said. Not accusatory, just precise. When Sethic displayed, when the graveling appeared, when the lights were wrong, you were never afraid. Priya considered this for a moment, the way she seemed to consider everything, not slowly, exactly, but thoroughly. I was alert, she said. Alert and afraid aren't the same thing. Missa absorbed this, filed it somewhere important. Sethic was afraid, she offered. From across the kitchen, Sethic made a sound that was technically a word in Vithara, but which I'll generously translate as something between "that's not accurate" and "please stop." Liura drifted in from the common area and took her seat at the table with the air of someone who had predicted this outcome and was experiencing no satisfaction from being right, none whatsoever. Certainly not. Torvin appeared in the doorway, assessed the emotional temperature of the room, determined it was survivable, and came fully inside. He settled into his chair, his patches cycling through a slow progression from anxiety yellow toward something closer to cautious amber, and he looked at Priya with an expression she'd learned to read in Vithara children, as the precursor to a question they weren't sure they were allowed to ask. "Go ahead," she said. Torvin blinked all 4 of his eyes in sequence. "Were you ever afraid," he asked carefully, "when you were small, like us?" The kitchen went quiet. Even Missa stopped generating questions. It was the kind of quiet that happens when a child asks something that accidentally contains more depth than they intended, and everyone in the room feels it at the same time. Priya set the last portion down, pulled out her own chair, and sat. She looked at Torvin with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was something adjacent to one, warmer than professional, more honest than comfortable. "Yes," she said, frequently. "Of what?" Liura asked, and her tone had shifted slightly. The 12-year-old who always knows the answer had been quietly replaced, just for this moment, by a 12-year-old who genuinely wanted to know. Mostly the dark, Priya said. When I was Mrs. Age. Also loud sounds. Also a particular type of insect we have on my home continent, that I am still not completely at peace with. She paused. Also my grandmother, occasionally, but that's a longer conversation. Missa laughed. That wind chimes down a staircase sound, and the tension in the room came apart like a knot in warm water. Sethic's patches climbed another 10% toward normal. Torvin's amber deepened toward something almost comfortable. Even Leora, who had principles about dignity, allowed herself a small smile. They ate, and something shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way that would make a good single scene in a lesser story, but genuinely. The Vithara children had spent 3 rotations building a version of this human in their heads. A target, an outsider, a temporary presence to be tested and dismissed. What they were recalibrating to, over a shared meal in a kitchen that smelled like their mother's cooking and someone else's calm confidence, was something more complicated. Something that required new categories. Sethic, who had not said more than 12 words since his patches went dark, spoke up somewhere near the end of the meal. "The sound you made," he said, not quite looking at her, examining his food with unnecessary focus. "I have read about human predator instincts. The research suggests they are vestigial, mostly non-functional in modern humans. The research is conservative," Priya said. "Yes," Sethic said. "I see that now. The researchers," Missa added helpfully, "probably did not drop from any ceilings." Sethic's patches flickered in a pattern that, in Vithara body language, indicates someone is trying very hard not to find something funny. It wasn't entirely successful. After dinner came the prescribed routines, hygiene protocols, educational review periods, the negotiated winding down that every caretaker across every species knows as the long, slow argument of getting children to sleep. Priya navigated it with the same unhurried competence she'd applied to everything else, which the children found simultaneously comforting and slightly unnerving. Missa tried to extend her schedule by claiming she needed to document her observations from the evening for a school project. Priya told her she had 20 minutes and set a timer. Torvin asked for a secondary check of the graveling's enclosure because he was worried about it, which was genuine. The animal had been out for hours, and Torvin, for all his anxiety, took his responsibilities seriously. Priya did the check with him. The graveling was fine. It was in fact in better spirits than usual. Leura went to sleep without argument, which was its own kind of statement. She'd made her assessment of Priya Okafor-Mendes and updated her internal files accordingly. And further data collection could wait for morning. That left Sethic. He was in the common area when Priya came back from Torvin's room, sitting in the low-curved chair that was his father's favorite, not reading, not doing anything purposeful, just sitting with the particular stillness of a teenager who has something on their mind and hasn't decided yet whether to say it. His patches were at full brightness now, normal, recovered, but there was a set to his secondary membrane, half extended, then folded back, that Priya recognized as the Vithara equivalent of someone opening their mouth and closing it again. She sat down across from him, didn't say anything, just waited. The way good caretakers learn to wait. Present, unhurried, without pressure. It took him about 90 seconds. "I want to understand something," he said finally. "All right. You knew we were planning something. From the beginning." "From before the beginning," she confirmed. He processed that. "Ellen told you about the lighting console. The graveling. Ellen flagged some things. I inferred others. You're 14, Sethic. You're clever. But you've also never had to hide anything from someone who was specifically trained to notice the things you're trying to hide." His patches flickered. Not embarrassment this time, something more like genuine consideration. "The ceiling," he said. "You knew I was still coming." "I would have come," Priya said simply. "At your age, after all that preparation, I absolutely would have come." Something in that answer landed differently than he expected. You could see it, the slight shift in his posture, the way his membrane settled. He'd expected on some level to be lectured, or dismissed, or subjected to a patient explanation of why the evening had been inappropriate and what the correct behavior would have been. What he'd gotten instead was a woman telling him, with complete honesty, that she understood exactly why he'd done it, that she'd have done the same, The sound, he said, and then stopped. You can ask, where did you learn it? His voice had shifted from the studied carelessness of a teenager into something younger and more direct. That sound. It was not in any research I found. It was not in the xenopediatric protocols. It was not in anything. Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, my grandmother. Sethik waited. She grew up in a part of my planet, Priya said, where the large predators were real and present and not theoretical. Her grandmother taught it to her. Her grandmother's grandmother taught it to her grandmother. It goes back a very long way. She paused. Humans have been prey, Sethik, for longer than we've been anything else. We remember it. Not up here, she touched her temple, but somewhere older than that. We remember what it felt like to be small in a world that had things in it that could eat us, and we remember what we learned to do about it. The common area was quiet. Outside, through the curved habitat walls, the soft hum of the station doing its endless, indifferent business went on without them. Sethik's patches glowed steady and bright, not the frantic blaze of his ceiling entrance, something calmer than that, more considered. That is, he said slowly, actually very interesting. I thought you might think so. We, the Vithara, we also come from prey, he said. Originally, the ancestral records describe the Grethkin, large, territorial. They hunted us for approximately 60,000 years before we developed sufficient technology to alter the balance. His membrane shifted thoughtfully. We do not talk about it much. It is considered an uncomfortable history. Most of the best histories are, Priya said. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he probably hadn't since she'd walked through the door with her calm and her bag and her complete absence of fear. You are strange, he said. Not unkindly. Thank you, she said. Also not unkindly. He went to bed 20 minutes later. No argument, no extension negotiation. He simply got up, said goodnight with the particular sincerity of someone who means it and isn't sure how to make that obvious, and went to his room. Priya sat in the common area for a while after, going through the rest of the ambassador's notes with Ellen providing quiet annotations, the graveling having somehow migrated to the common area and arranged itself into a comfortable shadow at her feet. You could have been gentler with them, Ellen said at one point. Neutral tone, not a criticism, a data point. I could have, Priya agreed. The sound was a significant escalation relative to the initial situation. It was proportional to what they'd planned, she said. They spent 3 rotations on this, Ellen. They deserved a real response, a genuine one. She looked up from the console. Children who scheme that carefully don't actually want to win. They want to find out if you're worth scheming against. A pause. And are you? Priya smiled, the private one again, the one that confirmed things she already knew. Ask them in the morning, she said. Morning came, station time, artificial sunrise warming the curved walls from amber to pale gold, and Priya was already in the kitchen when the first set of footsteps came down the corridor. She'd reviewed the breakfast protocols, had everything staged, and was running through the day's schedule on her comm, when Missa arrived, 6 feet silent on the smooth floor, 4 eyes bright and immediately, relentlessly awake. She climbed onto the counter, took up her observation position, and without preamble, with the directness of a child who had spent the night processing data, said, I want to learn the sound. Good morning, Missa. Good morning. I want to learn the sound. Priya looked at her for a moment. It takes practice, she said. It's not something you can do from research alone. I know, Missa said. That is why I am asking you to teach me. Liura arrived, assessed the conversation already in progress, and settled into her chair without comment. Torvin came in at his usual careful pace, checked that the graveling was visible and accounted for, and sat down, and then Sethik, the last, the oldest, the one who had dropped from a ceiling and sat on a kitchen floor and asked the questions he hadn't planned to ask, came in, looked at Priya, and without any of the studied carelessness of the previous evening, simply said, What are we learning today? And Priya Okafor-Mendes, xenopediatric educator, temporary caretaker, and apparent direct descendant of something that had frightened predators back across 60,000 years of uneasy evolutionary history, set down her comm, and smiled. Breakfast first, she said. Then we'll talk. Here's what I want you to understand about humans. Not the things in the files, not the biology, not the history, not the certified xenopediatric credentials and the letters of recommendation, the thing that the files can't quite catch, the thing that 4 Vithara children were in the process of learning over a shared breakfast on a station that spun quietly through the indifferent dark. Humans are not fearless. They are not invincible. They do not lack the capacity for terror. In fact, from what I've observed, they have it in abundance, in deep and complicated forms, that their poets have been cataloging for thousands of years. What they have, instead, is something stranger and more durable than fearlessness. They have the memory of what it cost their ancestors to survive, and they have the audacity to carry that memory forward and use it, not as trauma, not as limitation, but as a tool, sharp and quiet and ready, like something kept in a drawer, brought out only when it's needed. They were prey once. Small things in a large world, moving carefully through the dark. They remember, and every now and then, when something drops from a ceiling at them in full bioluminescent display, they reach back into that memory, and they remind whatever's in front of them that the small things, given enough time, have a way of becoming something else entirely. Sethic's patches glowed warm and steady over his breakfast. Missa asked 14 more questions before the meal was finished. Torvin's anxiety amber had, for the first time in recent memory, settled all the way down into a shade that might generously be called content. And Liura, who always knew the answer, who had predicted everything correctly and claimed no satisfaction from it, looked at Priya across the table with an expression that meant she was already revising her estimates upward, already making room in her internal files for a category that hadn't existed yesterday. The category was, roughly translated, "Do not try this again." But also, and this was the part Liura would spend the next several years thinking about, find out everything. Somewhere in the ventilation system, completely unoccupied for the first time in 3 rotations, the ducts were very, very quiet.